You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, and All Things Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Unfortunately, Mike has lost his voice, so I will be standing in for Mike during the introduction phase of this podcast. However, we still have the discussion later. In early 2018, the Sacramento Bee reported that, quote, Vallejo police detective Terry Poyser, who has worked the Zodiac case for 4 years, said his agency has submitted 2 envelopes that contain letters from the Zodiac killer for a type of advanced DNA analysis that previously had not been available in the case. Poyser declined to identify the lab, but said it would attempt to obtain a full DNA profile from saliva on the envelope flap and stamps. He said he expected to have the results back from the lab as soon as in the next few weeks, and almost certainly by summer. The department has 3 letters and 2 envelopes from the Zodiac, Poyser said. The envelopes each have a double stamp, which Poyser said was a trademark of the Zodiac. They originally were sent to the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Examiner, he said. The 3rd letter was sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, but does not have an envelope with it, he said. As of this podcast recording, 3.5 years later, with no further news, another approach is needed. Geographic profiling is a technique where the locations of a particular set of crimes are analysed with a view to identifying the most likely home location or anchor point of the perpetrator, using the actions of the perpetrator to work against them. At a time when geographic profiling didn't exist, the Zodiac killer would have adopted some of the common sense principles that apply to us all. In this podcast, we will examine some of the tools used by geographic profilers to narrow down the search area so that investigators can prioritise and target the likeliest areas for the anchor point of the Zodiac killer. It can never replace good old-fashioned police work and forensic evidence, but with money and man-hours a consideration in virtually all investigations, it can help to focus the investigation and serve as an accompaniment in the crime-fighting arsenal. Killers will often, particularly during their first crimes, target areas that are familiar to them. This is the comfort zone of a killer, in which they will employ a target backcloth, this being the killer's mental map of spatial surroundings and the areas where victims are most likely to be found. These crimes may expand outwards from their home locations or anchor point with time as the killer gains in confidence. Their attacks may also give us a clue to the time constraints that the killer is operating under. We are fairly certain that the Zodiac killer travelled by vehicle to each of his crime scenes, who, if lived in Vallejo throughout, and the geographic profiling observations bear any weight, would have driven a limited distance, possibly a matter of a few miles, for his first 2 Friday attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, before venturing between 35 to 40 miles for his 2 Saturday attacks at Lake Berryessa and Presidio Heights. Had our killer worked from Monday to Friday, the 2 Saturday attacks, which were the 3rd and 4th attacks, could be explained through greater confidence and less time constraints. The distance decay function of geographic profiling argues that crimes are less likely to occur the further we travel away from an offender's home. This is easy to demonstrate when we have plenty of attacks, because the cluster of attacks in a particular area may identify the likely region of the offender's home, with the attacks diminishing the further we travel away. The known Zodiac killer attacks only total 4, making this assessment much more difficult. In 1993, Cantor and Larkin proposed the circle theory of environmental range that suggested a circle drawn around the 2 furthest offences from each other would likely reveal the offender's home base at or near the centre of the circle. In conjunction with these observations, other factors must be considered when attempting to identify the Zodiac killer's home residence or anchor point. The Zodiac killer made 2 phone calls after the second and third attacks, giving us some limited directional movements of our offender in the 40 and 70 minutes after each crime, who one could argue headed home to clean up and seek refuge in the aftermath of each attack. But we also have the 20-plus communications he mailed, predominantly from San Francisco to the San Francisco Chronicle. This could be the killer's home location or the area he mailed the communications while travelling to work during the weekdays. If you go to geographicprofiler.com, you can check out the geo-profile of many serial killers, including the Zodiac killer, using the software geo-profiling tool Rigel. The heat map generated shows as a percentage search cost. Suspects are ranked based on their search cost, the percentage of the map searched before reaching the suspect's anchor point. The search is conducted from the highest point of probability to the lowest. Therefore, the lower the search cost, the more viable the suspect. If the geographic profile is accurate, the offender will have a low search cost. In the case of search cost, the word map refers only to the portion of the profile containing the crime scenes. As a result, suspects can have a search cost greater than 100%, which means a space larger than the area containing the crime scenes would have to be searched before reaching their anchor point. A serial killer displaying the traits of a marauder will operate using a buffer zone from their residence, but radiate from this base when committing their murders, whereas a commuter will operate outside their normal activity spaces, thereby shifting the focus of the investigation away from the offender's anchor point. So if the Zodiac killer was a commuter, then he could very well be a resident of, say, Oakland or San Jose, but travel larger distances to commit his murders. There have been several studies done that suggest the vast majority of serial killers are marauders who venture out from their anchor point with the distance chosen from their residence based upon a buffer zone, the least effort principle, distance decay, and a mental map of the area. Cantor and Young noted from a geographical standpoint that a commuter's crimes will generally be grouped closer together, whereas a marauder's crimes will be more spaced. If the Zodiac killer was a commuter living in Vallejo, one would expect him to commit multiple attacks at a secondary location such as San Francisco in an attempt to divert the focus of the investigation far from home. Grouping the attacks within San Francisco would achieve this objective, but spreading the attacks would effectively nullify this tactic. A killer living in Vallejo may attempt to spread his attacks in all directions, with each subsequent attack designed in such a fashion to confuse investigators trying to pinpoint the murderer's anchor point, but may in essence have the reverse effect to the one desired. However, there is one important factor to unpick when we consider the Zodiac killer compared to most serial murderers, and that is the copious communications he mailed primarily from San Francisco. The Zodiac killer attacks took on the appearance of a marauder, whereas his letter writing took on the appearance of a commuter, which is exactly what he would have been had he worked in San Francisco and lived in Vallejo. When your letter writing count outweighs your murder sites 5-1, it is far easier to employ your letter writing in order to focus the investigators into the belief that you live in San Francisco when it requires no more effort than travelling to work each day. The final confirmed murder at Presidio Heights could have been a deliberate choice by the killer, determined to divert the investigation down a path far from home, but may have achieved the complete opposite to the one intended. Canadian criminologist Kim Rosmo stated, The San Francisco murder differs significantly from the Zodiac's other crimes. Up to this point, he was hunting in locations that had a good probability of containing his desired victims. Target selection was a function of area, not of an individual. However, it is unlikely the Zodiac was successful in all his searches. Serial killers typically engage in extensive hunting activities, and for every attack, there are many unsuccessful search attempts. In San Francisco, however, the Zodiac controlled this situation through his selection of victim type. The need for such control could be indicative of the distance the Zodiac killer had to travel to the crime site. Criminals who travel longer distances to offend are less likely to use uncertain target selection techniques. In other words, the selection of a taxicab driver in San Francisco meant the Zodiac killer could control the target rather than searching for victims in a location he was less familiar with. One of the most significant and hotly debated elements of the Zodiac case is that the killer at Blue Rock Springs made a phone call from the intersection of Springs Road and Tuolumne Streets at 12:40 a.m., despite this payphone being only 8 to 10 minutes journey time from the crime scene. What did the Zodiac killer do in this unaccounted period of time? It has been proposed that the Zodiac killer likely lived near to the payphone, using this time to disassociate himself from his vehicle, the smoking gun, and his clothing, thereby making the payphone call in absence of any incriminating evidence. Had he lived in San Francisco, Napa, or Oakland, why not make the phone call equidistant from the crime scene to his residence, thereby minimizing the risk? The notion of a killer living in close proximity to the payphone has been countered by many who state that the killer may have just driven around during this 40-minute window or had parked up somewhere, savouring his achievement before placing the call. The Zodiac killer may originally have planned to make the payphone call immediately after the crime, but something he hadn't planned for may have transpired at the crime scene. That thing was Michael Mageau not dying after the first barrage of gunfire. Michael Mageau was shot 2 times while sitting in the front seat of the Corvair, striking his facial region and shoulder. Both of these bullets exited Michael Mageau's body and entered Darlene Ferrin, partly accounting for the 9 entry wounds noted on Darlene Ferrin at autopsy. This means that Michael Mageau had 2 entry wounds and 2 exit wounds before he managed to propel himself over the front seat to the rear passenger compartment. It is certainly plausible that by sustaining 4 wounds and pushing himself over the front passenger seat, he transferred blood onto the top of the passenger seat while seeking refuge in the rear of the vehicle. After the initial 5 shots, it appeared that the Zodiac killer had concluded his attack, but his decision to return to the Corvair after hearing Michael Mageau cry out may have been his undoing, and why he decided to change his plans and travel home before making the payphone call. The Zodiac killer fired off the first 7 shots with his gun near to the open passenger window of the Corvair, but not one cartridge case entered the passenger side window to be found in the front passenger compartment, and not one cartridge case struck the top of the vehicle itself and travelled beyond, right or left of the vehicle. Every one of the 7 casings were found to the right side of the Corvair. However, the final 2 shots aimed at Michael Mageau while he took refuge on the back seat ejected 2 cartridge cases that were found lying on the rear floorboard of the vehicle, suggesting that the killer leaned into the vehicle a considerable distance to shoot Michael Mageau in the hip and thigh, likely transferring blood from the front passenger seat of the Corvair to the shooter's blue shirt, described as such by Michael Mageau. This may very well be the reason why the Zodiac killer thought it wise to travel home first and change clothes, rather than just hang around in public for at least 40 minutes. The cries of Michael Mageau could possibly have changed the subsequent actions of the Zodiac killer that morning, who thought it profoundly more sensible to change his clothes before making the payphone call to Nancy Slover on July the 5th, 1969. Before the advent of the Rigel software system, utilising the geographic profiling techniques of criminologist Dr. Kim Rosmo, a rudimentary form of geographic profiling was used by Stuart Kine before the capture of the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe. This is mentioned by Dr. Kim Rosmo in a 1998 NCIS conference, stating, "I'm sure people in this room are familiar with this case. This is an example of an investigation going awry because of geography. The tape that was sent to investigators from someone claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper led to analysis of the accents. They felt was a Geordie accent. The person was from the Sunderland area, and they focused on that part of England, which was about 100 miles away from where the crimes were occurring. That was wrong. Sutcliffe lived close to the area. Interesting, and I'm not sure how many people are aware of it, but shortly before Sutcliffe's arrest, through the work of some patrol officers, a Home Office scientist by the name of Stuart Kine did a sort of basic geographic analysis of the crimes and was quite successful, as it turned out, in his predictions. He was, in fact, very accurate, bearing in mind the size of the killing field, and by literally sticking pins in a map, highlighted an area somewhere by Shipley, only 6 miles from the 6 Garden Lane Bradford address of Peter Sutcliffe. BCU professor Craig Jackson explained how time can be analysed with respect to a killer's hunting grounds, using Peter Sutcliffe as an example, stating, "Wherever the Yorkshire Ripper was based, the time of his murders would be a vital clue to where he lived. So if one of the Yorkshire Ripper's victims was murdered in the early evening, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, that individual could be based very far away from where the Yorkshire Ripper's base was. But if the victim was murdered in the very small hours, midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, that victim would be probably very close to where the Ripper's base was, assuming that the Ripper would have to be home at a reasonable time to be with their partner or families or friends who they live with." Putting aside the Lake Berryessa attack, which relied on daylight for maximum impact regarding his costume, and the likely lack of potential victims at night, the Lake Herman Road attack occurred at approximately 11:15 p.m, the Blue Rock Springs attack around midnight, and the Presidio Heights attack at about 10 p.m. A killer living near the Springs and Tuolumne payphone would arrive home from Lake Herman Road circa 11:35 p.m, from Blue Rock Springs circa 12:10 a.m, and from Presidio Heights, allowing for his walking time no later than 11:10 p.m. These attacks would have the Zodiac killer arriving home in a window of 60 minutes between 11:10 p.m. and 12:10 a.m. Had the Zodiac killer been conditioned by time and committed another attack in Eureka, 260 miles from Vallejo, 4.5 hours away, would it have occurred at approximately 7 to 8 p.m, allowing him to arrive home within the window of time just described? This may have depended on whether the Zodiac killer had a wife or family, where arriving home at a prescribed time is expected, or the Zodiac killer simply operated by way of his body clock to go to sleep at a reasonable hour. It is also important to analyse the content of his letters to examine whether the Zodiac killer subconsciously leaked out any information regarding his home location. When the Zodiac killer sat down to write the Trinity of Communications to the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle and San Francisco Examiner, he would be conceptualizing delivery of these 3 letters from the location he had decided to mail them from. The 3 letters were mailed in San Francisco. If the Zodiac killer lived in Vallejo, when writing the letter to the Vallejo Times-Herald stating he has mailed the other 2 parts to the San Francisco Chronicle and Examiner, he conceptualizes San Francisco in the past tense, so wrote, "The other 2 parts have been mailed to the SF Examiner and the SF Chronicle." When writing to the San Francisco Chronicle and Examiner, he leads with Vallejo Times on both occasions, and then the other newspaper, stating, The other two parts of this cipher are being mailed to the editors of the Vallejo Times and SF Examiner, and the other two parts are being mailed to the Vallejo Times and SF Chronicle. In both instances, he precedes Vallejo Times with are being mailed, using the present tense. If he was sitting in his Vallejo residence, conceptualizing delivery of the letters to the Vallejo Times Herald, he would use the present tense, because living in Vallejo, he would conceptualize his home city in the here and now. In other words, the present. When he conceptualizes delivery to the Chronicle and Examiner, he views them in the past tense because he has returned home to Vallejo from mailing the letters in San Francisco. This may not be definitive proof that the Zodiac killer lived in Vallejo, but combine this with the 40 minutes delay in making a payphone call that should have taken no more than 10 minutes, and his overselling in the August 4th, 1969 letter, adding the word car unnecessarily when he stated of the Negro male, "When I hung up the phone, the damn thing began to ring, and that drew his attention to me and my car." It makes a strong case that the killer was a native of Vallejo. Regarding the Zodiac case, Kim Rossmo explained the value of geographic profiling as an aid to law enforcement and how it can be used to focus resources, stating, "There's a number of possibilities, but remember, Rancho Vallejo was possibly 26,000 people at that time, of which only 13,000 will be male, and only a certain proportion of those are of the correct age, and a certain portion of those are only going to be white. Then we start looking at the neighbourhoods involved. We only have a pretty small subset. Then we start combining that with some of the personal and behavioural descriptors, and then we work in the vehicle information. If this case was active today, it would not be too difficult to find this person."
This is a Zodiac speaking.
The Zodiac killer at Blue Rock Springs fired his weapon close to the passenger window of the Corvair, yet every casing fell to the right side of the vehicle. 2 casings were found on the back passenger floorboard, other than those 7 casings that were found outside, suggesting the killer had to lean over the front passenger seat for the casings to fall here and to shoot Michael Mageau in the hip and thigh. Michael had 2 entry wounds and 2 exit wounds. Both bullets passed through his facial area and shoulder into Darlene Ferrin, thereby producing 4 bleeding wounds close to the top of the passenger seat. The Zodiac killer may have planned to make the phone call immediately after the shooting, but he may have transferred blood from the car seat to his shirt when leaning over the seat to shoot at Michael Mageau. This may explain why he delayed the phone call and went home to change his clothes, effectively making a crucial error in his timeline. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of blood transfer to his blue shirt?
Well, I'll answer your question, but first I want to apologize to the listeners because my voice is choppy. I'm sick right now, but I'm trying to champion through this and go through it. So please excuse my voice. I agree with you that there's a possibility that Zodiac could have had some cast off or some blood spatter from shooting inside the car, reaching in, trying to get the best shot he could. Maybe that came back on him. Depending on the angles and the trajectory and different conditions, maybe it even sprayed back in his face. You know, it's hard to say what exactly happened because it was a confined space. But I'm right there with you. Driving 2.7 miles or whatever the distance was, I don't have it right in front of me, should have taken going the speed limit about 10 minutes. But the call came 30, 40 minutes later, depending on what report you rely on. So you have to ask yourself, where was the Zodiac during that 20 minutes, that missing time, whatever it is, 20, 30 minutes. It should have taken 10 minutes. He called 30, 40 minutes later. To me, the most likely scenario is that he went home, changed his clothes, probably stashed his gun, maybe even parked his car. I happen to believe he lived close to that phone booth. And I happen to believe that he lived close to that phone booth and walked to it. That way his car would be out of sight in case someone someplace saw it. He wouldn't have the guns with him, and he'd be all nice and cleaned up so that if he was stopped, he's just a guy out for a walk or whatever. There's nothing tying him to the crime. So to me, that scenario makes the most sense, that he went home, cleaned up, and ditched his stuff.
Do you think there's any possible way those casings could be found on the back floorboard without him having leant seriously into that vehicle?
Well, as someone who does some shooting, again, if this is a right-handed shooter and you're turned at an angle into the car, especially if Mike's going back into the backseat, as we know he did, if you're a right-handed shooter aiming through the window into the car and it's a right-handed gun, it's going to eject the shells to the right. So it makes sense that his hand could be in there. The shells are going to eject to the right, and not out of the car, but rather in the car and bounce around and remain in there. So to me, I think it's very possible that the shells would be in there if he reached in there. And if it was a left-handed ejecting gun and he was shooting left-handed from outside, the shell casings would bounce to the left and out of the car. So to me, that indicates someone that probably was a right-handed shooter.
And there's no evidence he opened the door either, is there?
No, and that's been a little bit of, some people have tried to claim that he did, and but as all the reports seem to indicate that he just simply walked up, started shooting, didn't say anything, opened fire, and never tried to get inside the vehicle.
Well, this next thing I'm going to analyse will point again to whether we believe he lived in Vallejo or say San Francisco, which are the two most common areas that people think he lived. You might disagree with me on this one, but there are no images of the August the 4th, 1969 envelope on the internet. Until one is presented, I go with the notion there was never one in the first place, and the letter was hand-delivered to the examiner. We would have to believe this envelope was lost or thrown away the same day it was delivered, because the FBI files make no mention of an envelope on the day of its sending. It was forwarded to the Vallejo Police Department the same day. If you put the 3 sheets of paper from the letter together and fold them in the middle twice, no address falls on the outside on its own. So why would the Zodiac killer write no address but for the fact he didn't address an envelope? And finally, it is important to find out whether an envelope exists, because if one didn't, the killer would unlikely travel 90 miles round trip from, say, Napa just to deliver a letter, or 180 miles round trip from, say, Sacramento. The hand delivery would suggest he either lived in San Francisco or traveled to work in San Francisco from one of the regions surrounding it. The only way the killer would hand deliver a letter to San Francisco with no association to it is if he lived close by. What do you think?
Well, I think first with the no address, I don't know what he was intending, but to me, there's no question he was drawing attention to the words no address. They're written in big, bold print at the end of that letter. So whatever clue he was trying to throw, whatever message he was trying to send, it clearly was something. He didn't just write that as big as he did for no reason. I think whatever he was meaning or intending is open to, interpretation. But as far as his living, working, I think it's pretty clear that you have the first 2 murders on weekends at night in Solano County. And the letters, for the most part, all are weekdays mailed from San Francisco. So I think there's a very likely scenario that he is living, working living in San Francisco and commuting to Vallejo on the weekends, or vice versa. But I think he shows the most time spent there at those 2 places. And if, assuming he has some kind of 9-to-5 job, the mailing of the letters on weekdays in San Francisco, to me, it tells me that most likely he works in San Francisco, or he perhaps works there, lives there, and commutes to Vallejo because he has some kind of ties there. I think he's definitely Vallejo based in some way.
So if he lived in San Francisco, you might expect him to deliver all his letters to another area, wouldn't you, such as Vallejo? So what do you think is the biggest argument against a Zodiac killer living in San Francisco, as many people believe?
Well, traditionally, most killers, they start out close to home and they will do a couple crimes and they'll get comfortable in their area. Then they'll expand out and move a little bit further. And then they'll get brazen and go out even further. That's in most cases. Here we have the first two crimes are in the Vallejo area. Then the next one is a little further away in Napa. The next one's even further away in San Francisco. So to me, this is a trend, starting close to Vallejo, working his way out. I think that he most likely lived in Vallejo. And to me, the San Francisco crime, so different from all the other ones, was to make headlines in San Francisco because it's the biggest paper in the Northern California, that area, those papers. So to really get his name in the headlines and what he did, I think that's why he did the Paul Stine murder.
Well, bearing that in mind then, and looking at the first communications he mailed, do you think the Zodiac killer affixed more stamps on the Vallejo Times Herald envelope compared to the Examiner and Chronicle envelopes on July the 31st, 1969, because he placed more emphasis on the importance of Vallejo, in other words, the letter arriving, possibly being his home city? Or do you think this was an obvious ruse to make us think he lived in Vallejo?
I don't know. I've gone back and forth between scenarios. I think no matter what, no matter how he sent the letters, whatever stamps were used, he might be trying to do a ruse. But in reality, I think he's pretty much telling us who he is. He's someone that's connected to Vallejo and San Francisco in some capacity. He's spending a lot of time in San Francisco to be there so many times to mail letters on weekdays. And his crimes originated in Vallejo on two separate occasions, 6 months apart. So to me, 8 months apart actually, but to me, I think it's pretty clear that he's got ties between these two areas. And, we can debate or go back and forth about which one he lived in, which one he worked in, but I think it's clear he's connected to both.
Well, the last crime happened in San Francisco, the last confirmed crime anyway. Have you ever questioned the convoluted notion of a killer parking his vehicle near Presidio Park and travelling in absence of that vehicle to the Mason and Geary or Union Square region of San Francisco to hail a cab back to where he'd left his vehicle? Why didn't the Zodiac killer just ring for a cab to pick him up at a desired location, enter the cab, and kill the driver without having to take a journey?
Yeah, I don't know how that went down. There's, we can all speculate about what's going on. To me, I would think he had something set up to get out of that area because, just my opinion, if you're going to shoot a cab driver, the last thing you want to do afterwards is call another cab driver to get you out of that area because they might, give statements to police about who took cabs. So I think he probably had a ride set up in some scenario. He had maybe a place he was staying there, visiting, a reason to be there, someplace to go and not have to rely on calling another cab to get him out of that area. So I think, he put some planning into it and had something set up so that he could make his way from there.
Which do you tend to believe? Do you believe he went to a residence that night in the close vicinity of the murder, or do you think he more likely did drive away from the scene back to, say, Vallejo?
I would think that he probably, and again, just my own opinion, just my own guess, I would think he had a car parked someplace and walked a couple blocks to it and drove off and mixed into the city at night. If he had caught a cab much earlier in the day to go in and do some shopping or see the shows or whatever, catching a cab from that area to Mason and Geary, to the area where he held Paul Stine's cab, he could have spent some time there, hours there even, and then went back on that fateful ride with Stein towards his car where he had it parked. So unless they went back and went through all the cab drivers' recollections that day of anyone catching a ride, which I don't know how you do that. There are probably thousands of people in San Francisco during that time catching a cab every day. He would sort of just get lost in the shuffle.
I hear that some people in the Zodiac community suggest that they witnessed the killer getting into the cab at Union Square or Mason and Geary. I've never heard of such a thing. Have you?
I haven't. No, not anything solid, not anything in a confirmed capacity.
Well, for those who do believe the Zodiac lived in Vallejo or San Francisco in particular, does the choice of Lake Berryessa as an attack site suggest to you familiarity with that reservoir? Because he could have committed an attack at any rural location prior to reaching Lake Berryessa, which is at least 40 miles away from either Vallejo or San Francisco. It's a fair distance. Should we be looking at somebody with a background of hiking, fishing or boating, or having previous experience with the lake?
I think so. I think he's got a connection there, and especially because it's daytime. If he wanted to kill people and just get away with it, he would go out at night when there's less chance he'd be spotted. So I think the most likely scenario is he was there doing what you mentioned, fishing, camping, hiking, whatever. It's an area that he was connected to in some way and saw an opportunity while he was there because there were a lot of other places he could have found couples and attacked them along the way. But the fact he's there during the daytime, I think that's pretty telling that he was doing something there and had a reason to be there.
Have you uncovered anything regarding your suspect?
I know he was an avid fisherman. I know his family, that was in the real estate business, had done land dealings in Napa previously. But I don't have any direct information saying that he was there specifically. I also know that he was involved in some Freemasons activity that sometimes entailed him going to Napa. So definitely some little tidbits, but nothing solid.
Now, I believe the Zodiac killer made at least 8 phone calls, but there's one dubious one that might be helpful. And this was to do with the Lake Herman Road attack. Shortly after 11:25, Captain Daniel Pitter radioed in the Stella Medeiros sighting of the Lake Herman Road scene. And about the same time, Pierre Bidou recalled hearing of a crank call being received, claiming an accident at the crime scene. This call, had it been made by the Zodiac killer, would have been received at around 11:25, about the same time as the report from Daniel Pitter. If it had been made at Springs Road and Tuolumne Street payphone by the killer, this would have given him just enough time to leave the crime scene at 11:15 and make this call from that payphone. The distance and the time is just about right for a phone call coming in at 11:25, pretending it's an accident and directing police to that area. Why would Bidou mistake a Daniel Pitter radio call asking for assistance to a crank call? And if he didn't, could a second call have arrived that night similar to the next 2 attacks?
Well, I think it's possible. The issue is, my personal opinion is I go by what's in the reports, what's documented there, as opposed to someone's memories of what happened decades ago. And there's nothing solid mentioning that. Now, if it was true and we could prove that Zodiac made a call to police from that phone booth again, a second time, that would be pretty powerful, and it would just lend more credibility to the fact he's tied to that Springs of Tuolumne area.
I mean, there was a later magazine article referring to a phone call at Lake Herman Road, but it didn't reference Pierre Bidou in that magazine article. But again, I don't know how much you can trust these magazine articles, but it seems like, where did they pluck this from? Out of thin air?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We don't have access to every report that's out there or all the news articles. So maybe there is some scrap out there that tells us a little bit more about that call if it came. Interesting, again, Bidou was, in that documentary, was recounting someone being lost after fishing out at Lake Berryessa. That seems interesting as well. He doesn't name who it was. But that seemed pretty interesting, just the fact it was tied to Lake Berryessa. But again, it could just be a coincidence.
You and I both believe that the killer likely lives somewhere close to the vicinity of that payphone. We can't say for certain, but there seems a high probability from everything that we've discovered. Now, he would have frequented bars, barbers, local shops in that area. So one would have expected, had he really looked like the sketch from Presidio Heights, that surely somebody, since there was a phone call made close to that payphone in that area, somebody would have recognized him. Does this tend to say to you that that sketch is not accurate after all, and he did actually wear a disguise like he claimed?
I personally don't think he wore a disguise at all. I think he just realized that, hey, they've got a sketch of me and I've got to give them some kind of story, or else they're going to know that I look like this. So I think he just made up the part about it being a disguise. I think his likeness is going to be similar to that sketch. I've said all along that I don't think the sketch is necessarily identical. It's not a digital photograph of Zodiac. It's something done by an artist based on recollections of witnesses at night. So he could have looked similar to the sketch, but there could be little differences that someone looking at him in the daylight back in Vallejo might not even think that it looks that much like him. Then again, there was a lot of people that looked like that. Any guy with glasses and short hair back then, could have a general likeness to that sketch. So I don't put too much into it that someone didn't come forward. I'm sure a lot of people did come forward saying, my friend looks just like that sketch, and they were probably bombarded with that stuff. But I could also see a scenario where someone might have known the Zodiac and known that he looked like that, but didn't turn him in because he looked like the sketch a little bit doesn't mean it was a reason to turn him in. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Can't get enough true crime? I feel like everybody has one of those cases. It may even be what really got me into true crime. Do you love the paranormal?
I guess clearly he's making a list and checking it twice. He's gonna find out if your soul tastes nice.
Then come join Blood, Guts, and Booze. I feel like this case is pretty well known. But a lot of people don't realize just how twisted this case really is. Every Sunday,
they started feeling really bad for her spirit, right? Her little ghosty. So they decided to invite her into their house permanently.
Nope. As we talk about your worst nightmares and things that go bump in the night.